Hey guys, in this video we're gonna take a look at a very interesting Tiny Toons game for the NES that you probably never heard of or played, and that is Tiny Toons 6. Now what makes this game so special is the fact that this is yet another bootleg game by our friends over at Hammer Team, who decided to port the first Game Boy Tiny Toons game, Bab's Big Break, to the Famicom and Famicom compatible devices. What Hammer Team did with this game is actually very impressive. They took the Game Boy game, colorized it themselves, and ported it over to the NES and Famicom and compatible systems. The game was released around 1997-1998 for the developing world, and a Russian translation of this game also exists. Now, Tiny Toons Bab's Big Break is a fairly decent platformer for the Game Boy, especially if you buy the Japanese version, which has a password system. While this game doesn't quite capture that wacky and fast-paced, hyperactive Tiny Toons feel, it's still a fun platformer, albeit with some issues that it has. For example, in my opinion, it's very slow-paced, almost methodical. All you basically do is get from point A to point B in a level. Some levels are less linear than others. You have to find a buddy who can help you with a certain obstacle, and sometimes after a brief mini game you are going to recruit this character and they're gonna help you get past a certain obstacle. Now, one of the biggest issues I have with this game is the control system. The jumping and moving are very heavy, they are very weighted, and there is this strange, weird momentum when you move your character. Now, in the game, both the NES and Game Boy game, you can pause the game in order to select which of the three Tiny Toons you want to play with. You can select between Buster, Plucky, and Hampton the Pig. They all control the same, however, their weapons are different, and the trajectory they throw their weapons in. For example, Buster uses carrots and he throws them upwards. At an angle, he is good for dealing with flying enemies. Plucky the Duck uses pineapples that bounce around the level, and Hampton rolls watermelons like bowling balls, I guess, and they're good for ground-based enemies. However, this adds some sort of depth to the game that is not really necessary for you to progress, because pretty much all enemies can simply be stomped on, and that's the end of that. One weird thing I find about the original game as well as the Hammer Team version is the fact that the buddies you recruit to help you through the levels, when they join you and you reach the point where they're supposed to help you with the obstacles, the game takes away control from the player and you just sit back and watch the character overcome a few obstacles here and there. Now that could have been some fun additional gameplay if done right, but for whatever reason the developers of the original game decided not to let the player control these sections, and Hammer Team followed suit, so it's not Hammer Team's fault that control is taken away from the player during these sections. Hammer Team's port retains the three characters and their characteristics just fine. However, they did remove some of the game's levels, which I don't understand why they did it. They have made much more complex games in the past, so I assume that this is because of time constraints or something. The first boss battle has been removed and the other boss battles have some of their mechanics changed. And the other level that they removed was a chase sequence with Almyra. as well as the sewer level that has vertical scrolling in it, where you enter pipes and they take you to different sections of the level, similar to what we have in Sonic games. Now, I assume that the vertical scrolling level has been removed because, in general, from what we've seen in the past, Hammer Team have their problems with vertical scrolling, and they have removed levels with verticality in them before as well, or have simplified them. The remaining levels are mostly intact, although they have been simplified and some obstacles in the later levels have been removed. So overall, while this is a port of the Game Boy game, it is a significantly simplified port. What's interesting is that Hammer Team also included the mini games, such as the racing minigame as well as the whack-a-mole minigame. The NES port controls pretty much the same as the Game Boy port, although I do seem to find the controls on the NES a little bit more comfortable for some reason. However, the NES version does have its share of glitches and bugs that I don't believe are present in the original. They're not all that common and can easily be avoided, so that's not that big a deal. Now, the version I have of Tiny Toons 6, for whatever reason, has invincibility enabled, and while I can still die when falling into pits, enemy projectiles, hazards don't really damage my characters. This is good for just picking up and playing the game for relaxation. However, this is not the way the game was intended to be played. I don't know why my version is like this, but there is a normal version out there. This, in spite of the fact that it has invincibility enabled, is an NES game or a famiclone game that I often come back to because even though it's not as fast-paced or fun as the, say, Sega Mega Drive version of Tiny Toons, it's still a very enjoyable game to me. So overall, guys, this is not a mind-blowing or overly impressive port, but I would say that even though it has very simple visuals, artistically it looks very nice, it's very cohesive, and the fact that they took a Game Boy game in 1997, colorized it so well, and ported it to the NES themselves is absolutely very impressive, especially when we know that official licensed developers couldn't do it right like what we had with the Aladdin and Lion King ports and so on. So this is a very interesting game to have, even though it has been simplified for the NES. What remains here is still a very lovely game to just pick up and play for a few minutes for relaxation. One of the things I love about the Game Boy version of the game is the fact that it has very simplistic visuals and is easier to see even on the original green screen Game Boy. For me, that's not to say I'm not putting a lot of effort to see it, but it's still much easier to see than, say, Super Mario Land 2 or something more detailed. One aspect about the Game Boy version of the game that you should always keep in mind is that if you want to buy this game, get the Japanese version, because the Japanese version has a password system. Now, this is not an overly long game, you can breeze through it in no time at all, but having a password system is always a nice thing. I initially, back in the day, I had the European version, I lost it, and when I got the Japanese version, I was just so happy to see a password system for the game. I often play this game on my emulation devices, both the NES version and the Game Boy version, depending on mood, because it's just such a simple game, and all the issues it has, such as slow momentum when moving and heavy jumping, are really not that big of a deal for me. I've gotten used to them a long time ago. It's just not a very deep game, it's a very simple game, but it has its charm and it's very enjoyable to play for pure relaxation. So guys, that's about it. This was a very short review. There is not much to say about this game, but I hope I was able to show you another interesting bootleg that you may not have played in the late 90s on a famiclone, Famicom or NES system. I always find these bootlegs very fascinating, in all honesty.